So Jeremy, man, thank you for coming on the podcast today. It's great to have you on.
Absolutely, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great. I've been following your work for a very long time. I think I've been interested in natural bodybuilding. I think, I kind of relate a little bit to some of your story a little bit when you mentioned that you started training in the same gym as Layne Norton. I didn't train in the same gym as him, but I started following him back in probably 2009 when I first kind of Googled teenage bodybuilding. I think Layne Norton had wrote some of the articles, and then I came across some of your work. I think initially a lot of the stuff you'd done, at least in that time, was around kind of blood flow restriction. And I know you've done a ton of research. I don't know if there's any people I've ever come across that have more publications or being a co-author than yourself. Maybe Brad Schoenfeld is giving you a run for your money, but I think I saw something like 400 papers or something like that, which is just insane. You're just pumping them out. But yeah, for those who perhaps don't know who you are, it would be great for you to do a brief introduction into your background, etc.
Yeah. So thanks for having me on. I started athletically as a wrestler. So I started wrestling when I was 5. That's where I stayed the most active all the way through high school. But one of the things that I always lacked was overall strength, because I didn't like lifting weights. I didn't care about it. I just really wanted to wrestle. But when I did start lifting weights and did start getting stronger, I did start to obviously really kind of enjoy it. And my friend, he was telling me, or he was kind of interested in bodybuilding. This was probably 2002, 2003. So we start, going to the bookstores, like a lot of other people, reading all these bodybuilding magazines, started to get really kind of interested into it. So that really set me on this path of lifting weights, bodybuilding, and wanting to study this. So that's what led me into exercise science when I was an undergraduate student. That's what led me to University of Illinois, where I was doing some research on skeletal muscle. At that time, I was doing animal research in that laboratory. That's where I came across Layne. We had been interacting for a long time on the bodybuilding.com message boards. So to meet him and then become friends in person was great. So went to Oklahoma, did my PhD, focused a lot on blood flow restriction there. Then when I graduated 2014, I took a job at the University of Mississippi. Now I'm an associate professor here. So I started in wrestling, got interested in bodybuilding / powerlifting. My story is I was always on my best day mediocre. So even in wrestling, there's days where I would beat people who I wasn't supposed to beat, and I'd lose to people who I wasn't supposed to lose to. So that's the definition of being inconsistent and average. So academics, a little bit better. So, but no, I've been at Ole Miss for, I guess this is my 7th or 8th year. So it's been good.
Yeah, I kind of got into bodybuilding the same way. It's actually through playing basketball. And I actually spent a month in Oklahoma when I was 16.
What part?
I can't even remember. I can't even remember the part now. I'd have to think about it. I didn't even think about it, but sure. I'd have to kind of go back and find it, because it was more than 10 years ago. But yeah, the AAU basketball, summer basketball, because we don't play it here in summertime. We do kind of clubs, like kind of you join a club and then you go to the school. I know it's a little bit different in the US. So yeah, it's crazy, because I don't think it ever would have went to Oklahoma. But it was pretty nice in there and very, very warm. But yeah, so some of the topics that we want to touch on today, you sent me a paper before this conversation about a week or two ago, that you had published, or maybe it was a rebuttal to a paper, but it would be interesting to kind of understand a little bit more, and that was specifically around the topic of does strength lead to hypertrophy, or does the strength that you gain, or sorry, does the what the relationship essentially is between strength and hypertrophy. So I know that's a topic that I probably talked a little bit on this podcast before, maybe with Greg Nuckols or some other person kind of a long time ago, but it would be interesting to get your take on perhaps what leads to strength, or what are the kind of the factors that contribute to strength, and then what the relationship between hypertrophy and strength is then as well.
Right. So yeah, I think the the paper that you're talking about was the paper's actually, it just came out, but we wrote it, at least the initial part of it, like March of 2020. So it was a long process to write the article, send the article to them. So we basically had a contrasting perspective piece where we both write our positions, then we swap, then we write a response to that. So the other authors were Professor Jonathan Folland and Thomas Balshaw. So basically, we were just trying to have some sort of discussion around what do we actually know about why people get stronger. And I think if you've ever taken any basic exercise science class or you read any strength textbook, the description always is when you start lifting weights and you get stronger, that's first due to neural adaptations, followed by large contributions from muscle hypertrophy. And I think that's widely accepted. I think everybody agrees that you can get stronger without muscle growth. I think the disagreement is how much, if any, does muscle growth play in strength change? So that's kind of the point of discussion. And, for a long time, I operated under the idea that, of course, muscle growth contributes to strength. Everybody knows this. So I came from that same paradigm kind of thinking system. It was through a lot of our own research on low load exercise with and without blood flow restriction, as well as just kind of seeing other things pop up in the literature, that we started to really kind of rethink this. And we started to go, do we actually know this? Do we actually have good reason to believe that a change in muscle size contributes to a change in muscle strength? And I think some people would say, yeah, there is good reason to believe that that would contribute. Okay, do we have evidence? Do we have experimental evidence that a change in muscle size contributes to a change in muscle strength? Because there's a lot of points that are arguing the exact opposite. So that led us to start to kind of think about this a little bit more and ask, why do we think this in the first place? What is the reason why we think that muscle growth contributes to strength? Where did this kind of come from, and what studies are usually cited for its effect? And then once we see that, can those studies actually experimentally determine that? So I think that's where there's a lot of discussion back and forth of, is there a reason to believe that muscle growth could contribute to strength? Of course. I think that there's reason to believe that. The next question is, do we have experimental evidence that shows that? And I think the answer, I think everybody would probably agree, is no, we don't. So in my mind, and in our position has always been, maybe we should reconsider how much weight we're giving to this, given how little evidence there actually is for it. So that was kind of what the paper was. I would encourage you, I know a lot of people have emailed me requesting my article, but it's important to read both articles so you can see the actual contrasting perspective. So I think it's good for this discussion to be had, at least so people can be aware that, hey, maybe there's not as much evidence for this as I originally thought, because that's, I came at it from the opposite side. I came at it from, this is obviously completely well known, and then I realized that maybe it's actually not well known as we expected.
So I think traditionally people would have mentioned, say, like you said, skill, neurological adaptations, and then muscle size as the three major components. At least there's probably some other things like femur length and things like that, maybe pain threshold and stuff that perhaps can contribute to strength. But if you account for then...
Hold on a second, just not to cut you off, but that's something that we have to be really cognizant of, is that we have to be clear on what we're discussing. So we're discussing changes in strength. So we need to think about what are things that change in response to exercise that could influence a change in strength from exercise. For example, femur length is not changing in response to exercise. That might very well have an effect on strength, how strong you are, but that's not going to explain why people get stronger with exercise. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What I was kind of getting at is those are the variables, and then if you kind of account for the confounders, as people get more advanced, at least this is my kind of current thoughts, as people get more advanced, they may be able to tweak their skill a little bit, as you see in like the Olympics, where they will stay in the same weight class and add 2 kilos to their snatch or something. But you do see typically that the biggest guys are the strongest guys as well, right? Or the over 100 and I don't know the Olympic weightlifting classes, but like the big huge the guys who are in like the 120 kilo plus class are stronger than the guys who are 60 kilos. But that could be then due to femur length and stuff like that. But so if you think that if like my thoughts were always that a powerlifter, for example, should focus or should do some focus or blocks on specifically hypertrophy to try and get more strength. Would that still be your kind of reasonings? I know that you don't have all the answers right now, but how much do you think it actually would contribute to it?
I think and what I always say during conversations like this, when I'm talking to people who actually coach athletes and who are coaching different people to perform, if you think as a coach that muscle growth contributes to strength and you believe that, then obviously do what you think is going to actually help your athlete. What I'm saying is that we don't have good evidence to believe that a change in muscle size does contribute. So if anything, if you still believe that it may contribute some, I think what it would tell us is maybe you could spend less time focusing on that. So maybe you have the position that, okay, there's not a lot of evidence there. Maybe that tells me that if it is playing a role, it's extremely small. So maybe I can set up the training to reflect that and say, okay, we're going to do some of this, but not as much as we used to, because it may not do as much as we thought it did, if that makes sense. Because a lot of that muscle growth work, it takes a little bit more time to recover because it usually requires a lot more volume. So, those are things that you can do. I would never tell a coach who's working with athletes who need to perform that, don't ever do that, especially if they think it does something. All I'm saying is I've come to the conclusion that I don't think there's any evidence that it does. And if it actually does contribute, it's going to be extremely small. Otherwise, it'd be pretty easy to detect.
So then I guess personally for me, it's probably not a huge issue because the people that I coach either compete in natural bodybuilding or have concurrent goals of being stronger and bigger, not just powerlifters or weight class. But this would have a big impact on those who are bound to a specific weight class, especially if you're at the upper end, right? Like I said, in Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting, you don't want to be adding 4 kilos of muscle mass if it's going to bump you into the upper class. And then there's guys who are bigger. But then what I don't know if you've found the answer or that you just have found that you don't know the answer, which of course is always going to be the way in science. But what would you think then contributes to those bigger athletes being stronger if it's not actually just a larger amount of contractile muscle tissue? Yeah. Is it things perhaps just bone structure or something like that?
Yeah, I think that we have to consider a couple things. One, what happens during development? In other words, people who are generally of massive size were of massive size for a long time, right? So not to say that they don't gain muscle size and strength from training. That certainly is possible. But people who are generally bigger tend to be bigger kids, bigger adults, right? Do you agree?
Yeah.
So I think that we have to separate what might happen from development, right? So when you're growing and you're adding a lot of muscle size, adding a lot of everything, that might be completely different than what explains why people get stronger when lifting weights. So that's what we're trying to explain. So it's very possible that if you add a tremendous amount of muscle mass during development and then you're an adult and you're bigger, there's no question that you're stronger. I think everybody is in agreement with that. Even if you've never lifted weights in your life, we see these relationships between muscle size and strength in people who have never lifted weights. In other words, those who are bigger tend to be stronger. Those who are smaller tend to be weaker. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in when people start exercising, when adults start exercising and they get stronger. Why is that? So two of the factors that are commonly discussed, kind of what we talked about early, was the neural adaptation and then muscle growth. So does this mean that if I'm questioning that if muscle growth may not be a mechanism, does that mean it's all neural? Perhaps. It could also mean that there are local changes at the fiber that occur independent of a change in muscle size. Maybe there's a change in the myosin motor itself. Maybe there's change in calcium kinetics. I don't know. But one of the things that we're starting to know more and more about is, well, the muscle growth thing does not line up with the changes in strength. Because there's many times, not only our lab, but lots of labs that see these changes in muscle growth, even at the fiber level, where the changes in strength are the growth is the same, but the strength is completely different. And that in and of itself doesn't rule growth out as a mechanism, but it's another kind of line of evidence that suggests, well, maybe it's not contributing, or maybe it's not contributing to the degree that we expect. So yeah, you could have some sort of change in the brain, the spinal cord, the motor neuron itself, the local level. I'm not sure. It could be a variety of those. I think our position is we came at it from the idea that muscle growth was part of that, but every time we investigate it, we don't find any evidence of that. So that's where we're kind of going, well, maybe we should just remove it from the conversation, or at least talk about it a lot less.
Yeah, I guess the best way probably to detect it would be to have somebody add some muscle size, doing some sort of training program, and then measure isokinetic force or something like that. So skill is completely removed. I don't know. That's what I would think, right? To try and minimize any kind of confounders as much as possible. So you just purely look at force, right?
Sometimes, but sometimes people want to know, like, for example, if an athlete is competing in powerlifting, they want to know, what do I need to do to increase my strength in this lift? So what contributes to that? So I think it's still of use to look at it in the movement of which you're exercising, even though there is that skill component. Because one of the things that, we have some data on this, and we've recently conducted a bigger analysis that's not published yet. But one of the things that you're describing is kind of a transfer of strength to a non-specific test. So when we looked at that relative to a non-exercise control, which is extremely important in order to quantify just random noise. So how much of that change in isokinetic strength exceeds random error, random noise? There does appear to be an effect of resistance training on the transfer to non-specific strength, but it's extremely small. And the amount of people that you need in a study to quantify that is extremely large, much larger than you would need to detect a change in the movement of which you're training. So for a long time, I was kind of under the idea, I'm like, because we would do studies with 50 people in a group and not see any change in isokinetic strength in response to isotonic training. But the reason why we didn't see it is because 50 people per group is probably not large enough to detect that small of a difference.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that would remove the skill component, no question. But it might also remove the question that you're interested in, which is, when I want to get stronger in this lift for this performance or this athlete, what do I need to do?
Yeah, it's interesting. In a clinical setting, would be like, or then kind of in terms of having a hypothesis for clinical settings, would be, if strength is not necessarily influenced that much by muscle size, then it may not be a good idea for older populations to focus on strength if they're trying to increase muscle size. in terms of, sarcopenia and all of these things, I know that they're not trying to get absolutely massive, and any kind of resistance training will be helpful. So I'm not sure if that's probably too nuanced or, just completely irrelevant.
No, I think it's interesting because, that's a little bit of a different side of the coin, because you're actually losing from baseline.
Yeah.
So whereas we're talking about an increase. But, one of the things that is interesting, though, is that there is a disconnect with aging. In other words, the loss of function seems to be much greater than what could be explained by a drop in muscle size. So when we talk about that, though, when we talk about start losing from our natural baseline, where we are just walking around independent of exercise, this might just be my bias being a muscle person. It's just hard. It's hard for me to believe that you could lose a lot of muscle mass from your normal baseline and have no effect at all on normal function. So I think that there is a lot of reason to try and maintain that muscle mass as you age, because at some point you're going to lose enough of it where it probably would matter, even if it is disconnected. But yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion that's occurring in aging, and they call that dynapenia. The loss of.
I've never heard of the term.
Loss of.
Yeah.
And to be fair, they've changed the definition of sarcopenia, because it used to be a loss of muscle mass. Now it's a loss of muscle mass and function, because function's the key component there. But yeah.
Yeah, and I guess there's some sort of neurological degradation going on as well that probably plays some sort of role in the function. But then just to kind of jump back into the topic of more specifically in terms of people who want to get, actually bigger, stronger, not for health purposes, but do you think that scales then even with, say, people who use like super physiological doses of testosterone or any kind of other steroids or anabolics? Because again, this could be just correlated, or it could be just that a small effect looks quite large when you have a ton of muscle. But when you see a lot of top professional bodybuilders, a lot of them are very strong. Now, again, granted, they could have been pretty big when they were younger naturally as well. So maybe that just is the reason.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, but I can say a couple things about that. I think that there's going to be plenty of bodybuilders who are strong because they're lifting weights as well, right? But I definitely am interested in the question, because does there come a point where you're able to pump so much in that you can get the muscle big enough to where it can contribute? Possibly, but I think we'd have to make the assumption that the injecting steroids doesn't do anything else. So all it does is increase muscle size. But I think that there's some discussion that it can affect the nervous system. I think they talked about that. There was a recent position stand in MSSC talking about that. Not just the nervous system, but that was one of the components that they said, is that increasing or injecting anabolic steroids can perhaps influence the nervous system, which we also know could contribute to strength. So it would still be hard to separate that. What I can say is, when you look at the steroid literature, I actually went into it thinking what you were saying, which is every time we inject drugs into some of these individuals, they're going to be bigger, they're going to be stronger. But that's not what we found. We found that sometimes you see an increase in muscle size, no change in function. Sometimes you see an increase in both. Sometimes you see an increase in function, no change in size. However, those were clinical populations. So what happens when you do it in people who are healthy and just getting it in the gym? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if
how that you're taking 1.5 grams and not 125 milligrams a week. You know. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. An interesting topic, because you do see guys who are just quite large, and but obviously there has to be some benefit other than just muscle size, because the sprinters in the Olympics wouldn't be using it because, you know, they're getting faster or something. So I don't really know much about it, but obviously it has some impact on performance.
Yeah.
You know, they're called performance enhancing drugs, not just physique enhancing drugs. So yeah, it's interesting. But on the topic of kind of, we were talking a little bit about clinical, the clinical side of things there. You've done a bit of work on grip strength and mortality rates. Now, I've heard this before, being kind of just, you know, people have said it to me in the past, especially when I was training, when I was a personal trainer a couple of years ago in a gym. It was like almost like a selling point to like older people. It's like, but then I've actually seen people physically try and prescribe grip strength exercise specifically because that's the measure that you used. But is it that grip strength specifically is related to it, or is that just the indicator or the way that you measure actual just strength or how strength is expressed? And is that related to strength or is that related to muscle mass?
Yeah, and I think the other question is it related to resistance training behavior, which is the angle that we kind of looked at that. So yeah, I think that hand grip exercise. So I'll deal with that first. So hand grip exercise. Is there a reason to do it to decrease your mortality rate by getting stronger? I don't think so. There could be reasons to do isometric hand grip exercise though at low force, because there is some evidence that it actually does reduce your blood pressure, even in normotensive individuals. So that was a surprise to me, to be honest. But there's some pretty good studies demonstrating that.
Would that be confounded by someone doing resistance training or with these kind of non-training populations?
Yeah, that's tough because a lot of these studies, all they're doing is isometric hand grip. So if you're doing heavy squats, does that eliminate that? I'm not sure. Yeah. But a lot of the stuff that gets shared is you'll see a study come out where they're looking at a population level. So what's a good way to test strength on a population? Here, squeeze this. So we get some idea of your overall strength level. And what a lot of times you'll find is that the stronger you are, the less likely you are to die prematurely. Now, if you dig into those papers, what you usually find is that just don't be in the weakest quartile. As long as you're not in the bottom, you're probably going to be fine. But there is some evidence that says yes, the stronger the higher your grip strength, the better health that you have. So what that leads to is that many people will look at that and go, okay, see, once again, some positive effects of resistance exercise. And again, just to be clear, I do think that performing exercise is useful. But when we look at those studies on grip strength, most of those people probably aren't lifting weights. They probably aren't doing anything. We've analyzed this before, not with the hand grip, but with isokinetic dynamometry of the lower body. And we found, again, stronger you are, the less likely you are to have mortality prematurely. However, most of the people who were the strongest weren't participating in exercise. So it tells you that it's not necessarily the behavior that's relying to this. There could be something just different about those people. And it could be a variety of things, right? There's a lot of limitations when you're looking at a population level with a single metric. It could be you're just capturing people with subclinical disease already. But it could also tell you about differences during development. That's kind of the angle that we hypothesize, that, hey, maybe this tells us that we need to spend a lot of time early in life to try and develop as much as possible, because once we get to being an adult, that overall strength change doesn't change very much. Because if I do whole body resistance training, my grip strength, as it's measured in these studies, doesn't really change very much, at least in the studies. So it tells me that maybe it's kind of an overall proxy of what you're trying to maintain as you go through adulthood. But yeah, there are those studies, but I think they tell us less about the behavior and more about there's just differences between people.
So what you're saying there is, can we influence, or we would have the biggest influence on our strength if we, in our by proactively doing something in our younger years? Is that what you're saying, or is this something that's more nature rather than nurture?
Yeah. Again, this is just an idea, and it could be completely wrong. But I think that one of the things that you said is that strength, maybe it's related to overall health. It's related to muscle mass. So where can we actually affect that change? Because there's some data that suggests that if you're a weak child, you become a weak adult. So maybe we can influence these children when things are actually able to change. Meaning that if you think about how much a child grows from when they're 5 to when you're, let's say, 20 years old, that's going to be way more than anything you ever change from that point on. So I'm with it that early in life we could probably influence a lot of things that might influence overall health, overall strength, overall everything. Because I think that a lot of them use strength as kind of a proxy for health, meaning that if you grew up in a poor environment with poor nutrition, right? That strength might reflect kind of that upbringing, because you didn't have maybe what you needed to grow to your maximum. And now that's going to influence what you're able to do as an adult. So that's an idea. And if people think that doesn't make sense or they don't agree, doesn't hurt my feelings. Just an idea.
Well, it probably has some sense to it, because in poor regions of the world, especially hundreds of years ago, the people weren't as tall, because they had poor nutrition. It wasn't because they had worse genetics or something like that. But it's interesting. I was reading a paper, and I think it was in Cell recently, about fat cells and adipocytes, and that you can increase the amount in your childhood, and then that kind of hangs around, but they don't increase in adulthood. They just atrophy or hypertrophy. So it's pretty interesting that how much that a lot of the stuff is influenced by during your kind of pre-PBS and PBS years. On the topic of then just the final one on the hand grip. So when you're saying the research, is that more observational and saying that weaker adults, they have a higher mortality rate, but doesn't necessarily say that if you have a weaker, you should then try and get a higher hand grip, and that will mean that you live longer? Or is it just pointing out that if you're weaker, you're gonna probably die earlier, rather than saying, okay, that means you have to do this then to try and get a stronger grip?
Yeah, I think that I think what it tells you is that it's better to be born strong than to become strong when you're an adult, at least as it's related to that. Or to be developed strong when you're a child than to become strong with hand grip as an adult.
Gotcha.
Now, that does not mean that there's no utility in resistance exercise. So one of the things that there actually is good evidence for with respect to resistance training is you have, for whatever reason, you appear to have a reduced injury risk when you're an athlete. And that's also seen in older adults. So you see it in these young, high-level athletes, but we see the same thing when these elderly participants complete randomized control trials. They fall less, they get hurt less, and that might help you stay functional for a longer period of time. So I don't think that's related to getting as strong as possible. I think that's in response to just performing the behavior. But that's a little bit different than trying to reduce your mortality by doing hand grip exercise. I agree.
Well, I think with strength, with muscle size as well, if you I think it's 2 standard deviations below normal, then that's considered sarcopenia. So the more muscle mass you have, and you can influence that as an adult, otherwise it would be doing bodybuilding. But I think that's an important point. So to jump into then something related to more so to bodybuilding, which is something that I think I may have read this paper a long time ago. It may have been called out, I may be wrong, in Alan Aragon's research review like many years ago. But it was some of the research that you had looked at in terms of contracting muscles with no external force, essentially with no weights. And I don't want to make 2 + 2 = 5, but then you've always heard from Flex magazine or Muscular Development magazine or any of these magazines when I was growing up, posing in front of the mirrors. And I think probably in Pumping Iron they even mentioned hours of posing, it leads to like better peaks. And I actually even heard many years ago that that's one of the reasons that people have like big arms, because they flex their arms a lot and they don't flex their calves, probably because they don't train their calves. But so it would be interesting to kind of hear a little bit about that research, and then kind of if anything what I said there would make any sense, or I'm completely kind of making huge jumps.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. That was a paper by my former student Brittany Counts. That was her master's thesis. It's kind of more of a proof of concept idea, because one of the things, it started with, again, kind of the low load literature suggesting that, man, the absolute load doesn't appear to be driving a lot of the muscle growth. The strength, again, being completely different, but muscle growth, very similar to that of high load exercise. And it was the same time where a lot of the work was coming out saying that not only that, the circulating hormones don't seem to be playing a role, an increase in that with an increase in muscle size, because muscle growth from exercise is a very local response, meaning that if I train my right arm will get bigger, but my left arm may get stronger, but not bigger. So again, highlighting that this appears to be a very local response, load-induced growth. So we were just kind of thinking and saying, if that's true, then if we were to take someone and just have them flex as hard as they can through a full range of motion, now that's not going to be, that's a high force contraction, but there's no external load. If we were to do this repeatedly, would we be able to stimulate growth? And if it's true that it's local and it's related to tension, and we do enough of those, it should produce growth. So that was kind of what we were thinking. And originally, I don't even remember what we were originally going to compare it to, but I was like, we need to compare this to high load exercise. Otherwise, I'm not sure I'm going to believe this. I want to see how it compares against, something we believe that most people believe is a maximal stimulus. And what we found is that strength was obviously different, and that's going to be a specificity component there. But muscle growth was very similar. Again, highlighting that, growth is a local response, and it seems to be in response to a sufficient amount of tension. So what does that have to do with bodybuilding? Does that mean if you add posing at the end of your bicep curl workout that's going to somehow augment it? That I don't know, because your muscle can only respond so much in a given training session. But if it's its own thing and you're flexing all the time, it's conceivable that it could do something. We do have evidence that as you said, that doing this does produce growth, and very, similar to that of high load exercise. But the combination of them together, I think there's going to come a point where you can only do so much within a short period of time. But if you have days of just posing, it might serve as a stimulus for sure.
And I did read some recent research, and I can't even remember if it was strength or cross-sectional muscle size. But even just imagining yourself doing the exercise, it was strength. The subject lost less strength when they actually imagine themselves doing the exercise. So I do think, there's probably a lot more going on than what we think in terms of just moving a bit of weight.
Yeah.
So the bros probably are on point to when they were saying, like, imagine how you want to look, or posing will maybe not as much as they think, but definitely maybe onto something.
It is interesting though, right? Because anytime you do posing practice, assuming that you're you're doing it more than just a double bicep in the mirror, it's exhausting. So it is conceivable that but even before these studies, that might have done something for sure.
Yeah, because I remember the first time, because I competed for a good few years now, but I'd always done like fitness or like these kind of categories. And then I started doing natural bodybuilding, and a friend of mine started teaching me how to properly pose. Right, so I remember I'd never felt such pain in my glutes.
Yeah.
Because you're standing there contracting your glutes and hamstrings for like 30, 40 seconds. It's not the same as doing a hip thrust, So
Right.
yeah, it's definitely interesting. And even clients that I work with now, it's like it's super hard to hold it, just
And a lot of
not
times,
feel like you're.
Yeah, and a lot of times it shows. You can see who's been practicing and who hasn't been practicing.
Yeah.
By what they look like on stage as well.
Oh, 100%. I remember the last show that I did, or the first show that I did in 2019. It was over in the US, actually, California. There was a guy who should have won his pro card, but he was huge. He was like 90 kilos and stage condition, which is what, I don't know, 200 pounds maybe, or maybe 195 or something. Yeah, he just could not pose. He was just he couldn't hold it. He didn't have the stamina, Like he could pose probably for Instagram, but he just could not hold it. So he lost it. Yeah, but it's definitely interesting. Final topic I want to touch on. I know you've talked a lot about this. And you've done a lot of research. Is blood flow restriction training a little bit. So it would be great if you could actually explain exactly what that is. Like obviously we're kind of occluding the blood, but exactly what's happening. In terms of, are we stopping all blood flow? Are we completely cutting off blood flow? And then does that have any kind of practical applications into people who want to get bigger or stronger? I know there's a lot of research coming out of it, and I know you I don't know if you spearheaded it, but you definitely done a ton of it. If you search blood flow restriction training in PubMed, there's a lot of papers with your name on it.
Yeah, well, blood flow restriction, and again, with the papers and research, that's always a team effort. So I've been fortunate to be part of some great groups for a long time. But blood flow restriction, as you said, it's essentially applying a cuff or a wrap at the most proximal portion of your limb. We apply it to the top of the arm, so covering the bicep or the top of the leg. And what we're doing is we're inflating it to a pressure that partially restricts blood flow in and largely occludes it out, especially during the rest. So blood flow is coming in, it's just reduced. And I think the important point to remember is that this is very acute. So we're not restricting blood flow for hours, we're restricting blood flow for minutes. So if we were to do this for a couple days, yes, that would probably be quite dangerous, but we're restricting it for minutes. So acute versus kind of chronic stimulus there. When that's done, when we combine blood flow restriction with low load resistance exercise, so 20, 30% of your maximum, we're able to see changes in muscle size comparable to that of high load exercise, and comparable and changes in strength, although those are usually a lot less, but we still do see changes in strength and other markers of muscle function.
So I know that I think it was a meta-analysis that Brad Schoenfeld had done with kind of looking at different loads, and I think it was 30% that if you went any lower than 30%, like 20%, you started to not see the same hypertrophy response as kind of higher loads below 85, but above 85%. But with blood flow restriction training, can you get even lighter than that, or is it still around the same?
There's several studies looking at 20% compared to high load exercise, suggesting that the growth is pretty similar. But it's a good point, and I think Brad's work and a lot of other people's work as well suggests that if you just take a low load, around 30%, and do as many repetitions as you can, that will produce growth very similar to that of blood flow restriction. We did that study over a decade ago as well, comparing blood flow restriction just to low loads. The difference is that the amount of work that you need is a lot less. But to your point, there probably does there is probably some percentage of 1RM that it might help to have some blood flow restriction in order to get a stimulus. So we've looked at this as low as 15%, and did a tremendous amount of repetitions. I think that we did see some comparable growth to that of high-load exercise, even with normal free flow, 15%. But in the upper body, the growth was a little bit lower. So I think 15% is too low. But 20%, yeah, I think adding that with blood flow restriction is going to produce growth similar to that of high-load exercise. Now, the other component of that is there may be some benefit to adding blood flow restriction to other activities. So, for example, there's some data, not a lot, but there's some, and there should be great caution with this first phase where we apply blood flow restriction in the absence of exercise. So if someone's just had surgery and they can't do anything, there's some, not a lot, some that suggest that inflating and deflating a cuff can slow down how much muscle mass that you lose. So that's the first phase. The second phase, and when we combine slow walking with blood flow restriction, in some populations that can produce growth. Now, in populations such as yourself, I cannot imagine that walking slowly at 1.8 miles per hour on a treadmill is going to produce growth. I don't think that's going to happen. I think people who can do exercise are going to see the greatest benefit with resistance exercise if they want to use blood flow restriction.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like what's going on at a molecular level or mechanistically to cause that. I think it may be out of Luc van Loon's lab in Maastricht, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Netherlands, about kind of blood flow and muscle protein synthesis. That an increased blood flow actually increases muscle protein synthesis. I don't know if that is probably very acute and very transient. But I don't know if that's perhaps one of the things that's going on. What is it that allows you to actually lift less weight? And obviously, I've done blood flow restriction. Your arm swells up, the blood is pooling there. Yeah. It's pretty painful. You reach failure earlier. But what's going on there that actually leads to a similar response?
Yeah, it could be, and kind of one of our working ideas is that you produce these metabolites that get trapped. And those metabolites, originally we thought that even just the metabolites themselves, just them being there, might start some of these signaling cascades and might in and of themselves be anabolic. I don't think there's a lot of good evidence to believe that's true. So we've started to really say what it might be is those metabolites are being trapped, and it's basically fatiguing cross bridges. So you're having to recruit a lot more muscle mass in order to lift the same load, much more quickly than you would if you were just doing it without blood flow restriction. So it's that idea that might explain why it's so fatiguing so quickly and why we're able to see this growth. Because once you look at the molecular mechanism, like the signaling pathways, it appears to be very similar to that of high-load exercise. So it uses what's seemingly the same pathway, the mTORC1 pathway. It has similar satellite cell responses, has similar phosphorylation responses. The gene expression response, when compared head-to-head, is basically appears to me to be the same, both before and after training. So what that tells me is that the mechanism behind how those motor units are activated is probably quite different, the strategy involved. Because to lift a heavy weight, that's going to require a much different strategy initially than to lift a very light weight. But once the fiber itself is activated, I think the mechanisms are very similar between those two, at least with respect to growth.
So I assume if the blood is if you're cutting off oxygen or sufficient oxygen supply, it's obviously becoming extremely anaerobic, right? So I assume some of the metabolite would be lactate. And there may be, I don't know what your thoughts are, but there may be some link between lactate and anabolism. But if you were to measure lactate levels, I know it's usually done like in the ear, but if you were to measure it specifically in that limb, like in the finger, would you see quite high lactate levels compared to normal, higher than compared to normal resistance training?
Sometimes, yes. I think that if you're doing lower body exercise and you're measuring the finger, you're not going to see anything until you deflate the cuff, because we have a lot of venous restriction. But yeah, the lactate is generally observed to be a little bit higher than the same exercise without it, unless you're going to failure. But when it's repetition matched, it's generally going to be higher. But you have inorganic phosphate, you have a lot of other metabolites that are thought to be fatiguing. So yeah, it could be a lot of different things. But that's kind of the idea that for trying to explain why we're able to activate all of these different fibers that normally aren't active when you're lifting such a light weight.
And have you looked at anything to do with muscle damage, or even separate to that, kind of recovery time or delayed onset muscle soreness in occlusion training, and how that compares to just regular training?
Yeah, when we compare it to the same exercise, so work matched, it does appear to induce a little bit more soreness, but all of the other markers of muscle damage are not changed to, or are not all that different. So I have a hard time knowing, is that muscle damage when you have DOMs and nothing else that's really differentially changed? Because you will be very sore. That I can say with confidence. But is that in and of itself muscle damage? Because when they take the muscle fiber and they look at it, it's a stressed fiber, but it's not a damaged fiber. There's no mild fiber disruption, which that's a direct kind of marker of muscle damage. So I don't know if muscle damage is occurring per se, but soreness is certainly occurring. But again, we see that with normal exercise as well. But it does appear that if there is any amount, that it does undergo the same repeated bout effect that you see with normal exercise. So the next time you do it, it'll be lessened. And then do it repeatedly, then, just like normal exercise, you're not going to feel quite as sore or sore at all.
Yeah, I've been using it recently myself because I've just been getting some sort of tendonitis in my elbow from just some sort of overhead tricep stuff. So it's been super helpful for that. And especially when I was prepping, when my joints got sore, it was great. But do you see any utility in using any kind of blood flow restricted training in another otherwise healthy person that's not recovered from an injury or can train normally, in terms of trying to get any additional benefit? I know I heard you on another podcast saying, the people who are like bodybuilders should try to do anything. They'll take any supplement under the sun to try and get an extra 0.5%. So do you think there's any benefit to doing something like that?
Yeah. So quick question before that. When you do the tendonitis, or when you have the tendonitis, is that pain in your elbow, right?
Yeah.
So when you do the exercise with the blood flow restriction, like during it, does it go away?
Yeah.
Or do you still feel it?
I just don't feel it as much because I have to go lighter. So that's going to be one of the reasons.
Maybe that's part
but I found that, if I go lighter though with just a normal weight, I have to do so many reps that it still aggravates it. You know what I mean? So of course I could do a lighter load, and I know that, quote unquote, I'll get the same hypertrophic response, but I'm doing so many reps that it still aggravates it. With the blood flow restricted training, I'm still getting 15 reps, but because I got that cuff, I'm getting to failure with a much lighter load, and it gets super large pump. But and maybe it's something to do with the blood as well, that there's more blood there, and that makes it less sore. I could be just speaking out my backside, but
I was just curious. I hear that sometimes, and you know how anecdotes could be, but I'm just always kind of curious. But for a normal person, I think that it's a tool that they can use if they want to. And I can totally relate to the bodybuilder wanting to do anything, because back in high school, it's like you go to GNC, the sports supplement store on the weekend. Yeah. It's like the discount rack, whatever's on discount, I'm going to take it all. But yeah, I think what I would say is, if you're a healthy bodybuilder or a healthy person in the gym, do you need it? Do you have to do blood flow restriction to see, quote unquote, optimal adaptation? No. Could you use it to make things more interesting from time to time, to keep yourself motivated? Yes. Could you use it to, if there's a time where you're supposed to train heavy and mentally you don't have it that day and it might be safer for you to train at a lower load? Yes, that's another one. Or if you're injured, then it's a great tool to use. There's lots of people who use it as just to try and spice it up, keep it a little bit interesting. But if your goal is to also increase strength as much as possible, then you're going to need to also make sure that you are lifting at least part of the time heavy. Otherwise, the strength that you get is going to be much reduced. The muscle growth will be similar, but the strength will be less. So yeah, I think it's a tool. They don't have to use it, but it would be produce similar growth as any other thing that they would do, but usually with a lot less mental and mechanical stress.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been using it with some clients who are doing some kind of weak point training. We're doing a ton of volume on, like, say, extremities, where just 1 or 2 days, because we're just doing a lot of volume, so that if there's any case that it would help with preserve kind of joint integrity or anything, this is going to be the time. But it could be just just throwing a dart and hoping that at least it's not going to be any worse.
Right.
But it's been great to chat to you, Jeremy. Where can people find more about you and your work, and do you have anything kind of in the pipeline that you can share that's going to be interesting?
Yeah, we started a couple studies. One of them has just now recently been shut down for the second time due to COVID. But yeah, we have a couple. One of them is related to kind of the crossover effect. So training one limb, what influence on strength does that have on the other? But a part of that study is also trying to get at some potential explanations for why people get stronger that are independent of growth. So, and maybe potentially independent of the nervous system. So I'm not sure what we'll find, if anything, but that's one of the things that we've been working on. So we're actually I'm going in about an hour. We have pre-testing today. So that's going to be Zach Bell's dissertation work. Yujiro Yamada, he came out with a review paper recently on cognition and blood flow restriction. So one of the studies that we've been trying to work on for 2 years now is trying to use blood flow restriction, some form of blood flow restriction with exercise to increase lactate, with the idea that can we improve some of this executive function. So that's what we're working on as well. And we have the last one that we're doing right now is looking at blood flow restriction, changing pain thresholds, following different types of exercise with and without blood flow restriction, and why that might be occurring. So working on several things. Again, I have a tremendous amount of students, and I've been lucky and fortunate to work with great people when I was a student and then have tremendous students. So it's the only way you have anything interesting to talk about is to get good students. So I've been, again, fortunate and very happy. But yeah, we're staying busy, and hopefully we can kind of keep it going with this COVID thing.
Awesome. Great to have you on, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Adam.